Shlomo Golliker. I direct the Russia and Eurasia program here at CSIS. I am very pleased to welcome you to this discussion with Denis Sokolov. Denis has been a fellow with the Russia and Eurasia program for several months now. And one of the things he's been doing is writing up his work. We've been very pleased to have him, in part because he is, I think, one of the foremost specialists in the world on what goes on in Dagestan, how the communities there are structured, and the role that less radical approaches to religion play in the region, and how that does and does not translate into violence, political violence, and for what reasons. So these are some of the things Denis will be talking about today, a preview of his forthcoming paper on the topic, which we will be publishing in the next couple of months. So Denis, over to you.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you for coming. Public opinion and experts in security issues often draw together Islamic extremism and terrorist activity into the following syllogism. Some Muslim radical Muslim become terrorists, therefore terrorists must be radical Muslims. In my presentation, I would like to develop 5 theses. First, I would like to demonstrate that there is no cause and effect relationship between Islamic radicalization, Islamic radicalism and violence. Second, radicalization as a strict following of religious rules could provoke conflict and disputes, but armed violence is a result of political conflict. Third, the radicalization of members of rural communities and the radicalization of the second generation of Muslims raised in cities initially 2 separate phenomena. And fourth, the participation of these 2 generations in armed conflicts has no direct relation to radical religious beliefs. Their participation has been exhibited in at least 3 different armed conflicts. The first conflict is inside in village communities. The second was unleashed within the context of the Caucasus Emirate, which actively operated in the North Caucasus from the middle of the 2000s until the beginning of the 2010s. The third conflict is the war in Syria on the side of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And fifth, participation of Russian Muslims in armed and terrorist groups is a consequence and not a cause of the existence of local and global market of violence, where financial flows and political status are the gods, local wars with accompanying media are the business process, warlords and military professionals as the market participants, and jihadists and other ideological volunteers and mercenaries as the proletariat for whom no other industry has been formed. The outlined conclusions are based on 9 years of fieldwork research on more than 50 rural communities, and migrants from many of these communities in Dagestan, Kabardino-Balkaria, Karachaevo-Cherkessia, Stavropol Krai, Rostov region, Astrakhan region, Tatarstan, Tyumen region, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and well as Turkey, Istanbul, Yalova, Gaziantep, Rykhanli, and Ukraine, Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa, Lviv, and Syria. Ukraine, because many of Russian migrants, Russian Muslims migrated from Turkey to Ukraine last year. I have conducted qualitative research in the form of deep and expert interviews, participant observations, and reconstruction of local institutional frameworks. Using an example of these rural communities, I would like to demonstrate how different generation of groups of Dagestanis from the same rural communities were involved in processes and 3 levels. In the rural communities, of Dagestan, re-Islamization, radicalization, and participation in local armed conflicts. In cities of Dagestan, Islamic communities, and the military underwood on the Caucasus Emirate, and out of Dagestan, work migration to big cities. The second city generation's radicalization via the internet, participation in different front of the Syrian war and ISIS. At the moment of the USSR's collapse, Dagestan rural communities, Jihad, were different in their economic, political, and religious development. I would like to proceed further with the consequence of the differences which include the level of re-Islamization, the existence of religious conflicts and local armed conflicts, and the participation of people from villages in religious movements in cities, the military underground of the Caucasus Emirate, and the Syrian war on the side of Al-Qaeda or ISIS. I would like to talk about economic aspects. The collapse of the USSR and liquidation of Caucasus led to degradation of rural communities that had managed to survive during Soviet times. Rural communities which had succeeded in creation of alternative to the Caucasus economy retained the majority of their inhabitants. Internal conflicts in community that had developed an alternative economy to Soviet Caucasus that were not involved in regional political, economic, and religious conflicts were limited by fragile discussions in Moscow. Touched by external regional intrusion, economically successful communities exhibited religious conflicts, a stable underground military, active participation in the Caucasus Emirate, and regional religious controversies. I'm sorry. People from rural communities which had not been able to replace the Caucasus went to valleys, to cities of the North Caucasus, to oil and gas extraction regions of northwestern Siberia, or to Moscow and St. Petersburg. However, from those Jamaat, where the economy was totally destroyed. The number of migrants to cities was massive. A significant number of individuals from the second city generation were observed to be ISIS participants. Now, I would like to present a political aspect. The scale of a village political conflict and its shift to military phase depends on whether interfering in this conflict regional political elite are represented by the native of this village criminal individuals, nomenclatura, businessmen, and clergy. At the level of rural communities, radicalization is provoked by social inequality which actively develops inside of these village kinship communities. Preachers just Islamize this social protest. Armed violence is a form of political conflict during which a new local political elite is formed. This elite, relying on the state monopoly of violence, blocks the political and economic activity of its political competitors, who are often competing group of families. They have to either yield, go to cities and send their children to study abroad, often to Islamic universities, Medina, Egypt, Syria, and Damascus, or wind up as participants in illegal armed groups. Acute political conflict in village often a precursor to the participation of people from this village in armed conflict in the context of the Caucasus Emirate. And now I'm going to say some word about religious revival. After the USSR had collapsed, a religious revival embraced all Dagestan. In the beginning of the 1919s, groups of Muslims from religious village every Friday departed from Juma mosques to other villages with a religion call. The most religious villages were the first to have the alumni from Islamic universities in Medina, Damascus, and Cairo, and as a result, they developed competing religious communities. Most of these religious communities were involved in conflict in recent years, when persecution has touched almost all Salafis, Hizb ut-Tahrir representatives, other non-Tariqa groups. Tariqa is a Sufi order, and non-official religious groups in Dagestan. Participation of communities in conflict, especially military conflict, was happening via religion politics. Examples of villages where armed conflicts happened: the real Islamic revolution in Karamahi, and conflict around the construction of hydroelectric power station in the Gimri settlement. There are many more examples not listed here. However, the Karata settlement could be cited as one of the numerous examples where radicalization has not led to armed violence. In Karata, radicalization first in the Sufi community, a group of Shamil, and afterward in the Salafi community did not lead to violence. But some young men from the third post-Soviet generation were found in Syria. Third post-Soviet generation is same second city generation, for example. The last example I would like to discuss is the Kastek settlement, which consists of two parts with completely different pathway. There are four villages: Kastek, Karata in mountain, Gimri in mountain, Karamahi. This is four examples of my presentation. The Caucasus Emirate could be categorized as being between village guerrillas and the global jihad in Syria. To some degree, the Caucasus Emirate has replaced organized crime and its leaders have been a part of the armed elite in the North Caucasus for several years and share the monopoly of violence with official government security services and private arms. Radicalization of the second city generation could be effectively described through the Jean Tirole model of collective reputation. This explains the formation of a glass ceiling, which in practice can be applied to represent the limited economic and political opportunities available for young Muslims in Russia. This discrimination of ethnical, religious, and other collective grounds is more complicated in cities than in rural communities. As a result, the mechanism of Islamization and radicalization of this reaction also differs from the one happening in villages. The second city generation of Muslim migrants from Dagestan had existed in Russia since the 2000s, when almost at the same time, representatives of the second generation of Ichkerians emerged in Europe. They are the children and younger brother of veterans of the First Chechen War, who had to leave Russia in the middle of 1990s. The great bulk of this second generation had never been involved in violence until several thousand Russian Muslims resorted to arms between 2012 and 2017. When Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria and their logistic network of recruiters and facilitators in Russia, Europe, and Turkey gave them the opportunity. Many people who had gone to fight missed this phase of radicalization. Individuals from communities which were not involved in rural armed conflicts and in the Caucasus Emirate, or the second generation from all those communities have wound up in Syria. First example, Karmahi as Thucydides Kirkira, as a history of Peloponnesian War of Thucydides, because for Russia, Thucydides.
Thucydides.
Huh?
Thucydides.
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 I have problem with Rutherford. This is a physics from from England. For Russia, Rutherford. Native English, Rutherford.
Right.
In the last tenth of the USSR, people from Karmahi and neighboring village engaged in work aside from their work in Caucasus. They grew vegetables and transported them by their own trucks to sell in different regions of the country, even in the north. A group formed from these Soviet businessmen afterwards contributed to the Islamic revival. Islam as a religion calls for protection of private property, righteousness, prosperity based of agriculture, labor, and commerce, which altered the idea of Caucasus. Formed under the initiative of Jamaat people, a liquidation committee took the case and the stamp from the chief of the Caucasus, and the Caucasus assets were sold. The proceeds proceeds were used to supply pipe for gas and water supply. A unique case for Dagestan, where all Caucasus assets were usually stolen. The former Caucasus lands were given to all households with a special reserve found for young families. In the middle of 1990s, one man died in a shooting during a conflict over political rivalry between Jamaah's people and representative of village and district authorities. With support from organized crime groups, the relatives of the victim, among them local and regional chiefs, tried to deal with Jamaah. People supported by one of the main politicians of the republic. In 1997, Amir Mukhtar, a leader of the religious community, proclaimed two settlements, Karamahi and Chibanmahi, with total population of 10,000 people, as a territory of Sharia laws. A Sharia militia was organized from young military trained Muslims in Karamahi. The militia maintained order over the village and patrolled its area. Religious education by Arab preachers and military training were organized in the village. Now Jihadist Ibn al-Khattab, who had organized the training center known as Caucasus in Chechnya, had a wife from Karamahi and often visited this village. Before the Second Chechen War, a minister of internal affairs, Sergei Stepashin, visited Karamahi. In 1999, groups of Shamil Basayev and Ibn al-Khattab intruded into the territory of Dagestan, and it led to the Second Chechen War. Karamahi did not support this intrusion and refused to disarm and did not let pass the forces of Ministry of Internal Affairs of Dagestan to Karamahi, as this raid of the Dagestan Ministry of Internal Affairs forces was a real mopping up operation and could lead to arrest of all groups of Muslims. Karamahi. This Karamahi village and this is usually home holds. From August 28th to September 12, 1999, a large group of troops conducted a military assault against a fortified village that was protected by up to 200 well-trained Karamahi combatants and volunteers from Dagestan, including a member of the State Duma of the Russian Federation. It was a mapping up operation in the village. A lot of men were arrested, including Amir Mukhtar, according to different data. According to different data, between 30 and 50 village defenders perished in the assault. Those who survived went to Chechnya or left Russia. The closest circle of members of the Karamahi Jamaah went from Karamahi to Makhachkala, Rostov region and Turkey. The Karamahi community now has authority with Muslim in Dagestan. In addition, the economy of Karamahi has been restored. Now it is the center of the cattle industry and has the largest feedlot in southern Russia. The feedlot are in any home in Karmachy. I think that in Karmachy are 5,000 feedlot now. Karmachy children whose parents had not participated in rebellion grew up to become the second generation of Karmachy combatants who took an active part in armed rebellion in the context of Caucasus Emirate. Rustam Asilderov, Abu Muhammad Kadarsky, a Karmachy native, was an Amir of the Caucasus Wilaya, a province in the Islamic State. He owed allegiance to al-Baghdadi. He was killed in the Talgi settlement in Dagestan on December 3, 2016, at age 34. Northern Karmachy man was tracked to ISIS in Syria, which indicates either a lack of participation or a lack of information of this statistic. Okay, Gyumri, flooded world. The Gyumri settlement is The Gyumri settlement is considered to be the motherland of Imam Shamil, who fought against the Russian Empire for 25 years. In the 19th century, Shamil remains the symbol of all anti-colonial resistance movements in the North Caucasus. The Gyumri people fought in First Chechen War, but their own underground organization emerged after the flooding of apricot gardens for the construction of hydroelectric power station. This project involved massive corruption and abuse over the payment of compensation and the distribution of work contracts for construction services. One of the warlords, a local martial arts instructor, said in an interview that he had gone to forest rather than risk arrest by government security services. He had attempted to get a piece of the action when the power station was being constructed by offering enforcement services executed by trained youth for Sharia guided and ordinary business transaction. However, became into conflict with government security services who already had other business partners. The business of the power station led to conflict in the village. More than 60 activities who tried to publicly defend the right of the population of fair compensation for the flooded gardens were killed. The stakes were high. Total revenue from one season could bring in $50 million to local farms. The hydroelectric power station could bring the same if profit, but for political elite. A leader of Gyumri armed group, Ibrahim Gurjadayev, was a direct member of this elite. He controlled the part of financial flows linked with energy supply, construction and servicing of the hydroelectric power station, and he was a big property developer in Makhachkala, the capital of Dagestan. He was instrumental in the Caucasus Emirates ousting of organized crime from the criminal market in Dagestan. By 2010, the Caucasus Emirate had started to use the so-called tactic of USB stick. An official or an entrepreneur is planted with a USB stick with two videos. One showing, for example, his children going to school, and the other showing an Amir with or without a balaclava dictating the sum of zakat and Islamic tax. Since 2010, officers from law enforcement have started to plant USB sticks themselves. Recently, members of the Internal Affairs Administration from one of district centers were convicted of racketeering and murder. An important role of the Gyumri underground and its leaders in the market of violence in Dagestan was the reason of constant counter-terrorism operation in this village. Almost all young Muslims were constantly arrested on trumped-up charge from illegal arms planted during searches. The Gyumri settlement is a leader in the Russian Federation Financial Monitoring Services list of people involved in extremist or terrorist activity. 65 people suspected and accused of terrorist activity were born in Gyumri. Gyumri, first position, and group of flooded villages, second position in absolute number. Including the neighboring village, 134 natives from villages that had flooded apricot gardens are wanted extremists and terrorists. There is no individual from Gyumri reported in Syria, but a minimum of 50 families and a head of mosque are in Turkey. They have run away from persecution by Russian law enforcement. Karata. This is villages in mountain, in Dagestan mountain. At the time of the Ussr's collapse, Karata was substantially secular, and now it is not very religious. All three Islamic communities in this village, including 2 Sufi and 1 Salafi, consist of 200 active participants. For example, in Karamahi, I think there are 5,000 active participants of religion communities. In the middle of the 1919s, from among the followers of Sheikh Tajuddin, one of the Sufi sheikh who had preserved Islam in small quasi-underground groups during the Soviet times. A new group emerged in Karata. Those young Muslims tried to limit the alcohol consumption, for example, but were met with opposition from the majority. Later, this religious community was augmented by joining a group of Karata people who committed fraud and racketeering in Moscow. Some of them went to Makhachkala for construction business. Here, the Karata people were the main property developers of the northern suburbs of Makhachkala. By the cusp of the 2000s, the Salafi community had emerged. There was not any conflict until the followers of Sheikh Said Afendi Cherkesky, the religious leader of official Sufism in Dagestan, appeared in Karata. The Sufis appealed to law enforcement to prevent the construction of a second mosque in the village by the Salafis. This conflict provoked a part of the Salafis to radicalize, and one of the most respected members of Salafi community was beaten. But the village leaders managed to prevent the interference of regional politicians in this conflict, and it was resolved. There were no participants in Chechen wars, no combatants from the Caucasus Emirate among the Karata people, but 15 people wound up at war in Syria. 40 fought as members of the Islamic State, and 2 from 15 went from Yuzhno-Sukhakumsk, a city of northern Dagestan, from which 50 people of the second generation of settlers from the mountain had joined ISIS. One big family moved to Syria directly from Karata. Almost all combatants went to fight from Makhachkala, and only 2 had previously lived or studied in large Russian cities. All of them between the age of 20 and 25, a victim of internet propaganda. And 5 of them have already perished. 3 managed to get out of 2 did it with the help of their parents. Those who stop fighting often become takfirists. They shoot themselves up in small communities or find other ways to isolate themselves from the world. And finish Kastek and Novy Kastek. This is city. This is a very interesting case. This village consists of 2 parts, Kumyk and Dargin. The Durins came to Kastek, Dagestan, from Chechnya, where they had been living since Chechens were deported to Central Asia in 1944, and where they remained until the return of the Chechens in the late 1950s. In the Soviet times, the settlers were doing quasi-legal businesses, producing full heads and selling them all over the country. One of the most respected Sufi sheikhs in Dagestan is living in the Dargin part of Kastek. He brought thousands of people to Islam, a majority of whom became Salafis. This Karata. The Dargin Novy Kastek and its religious community is divided into the followers of old sheikh, the Sufi Ustaz Dargin Muhammad, and the followers of his grandson, young Salafi Sheikh Abdullah Kasteksky. The Dargin took part in the military rebellion of the Caucasus Emirate. Some of them died in it, but they did not join ISIS. Moreover, it was the young Sheikh Abdullah Kasteksky who drove out the Dagestani Caucasus Emirate from Syria when al-Baghdadi proclaimed a caliphate. The old Kumyk residents of the neighboring village of Kastek, called Old Kastek, were less religious. Were less religious. After the USSR's collapse, they went to northwestern Siberia for work. About 70 families live in Pytyach, not far away from the ex-capital of Yukos, Neftejugansk. There were no participants in the Caucasus Emirate. Among the Kastek Kumyks, fewer than 10 people, many of the children of migrants in the north, have joined the Islamic State in the last years. And a lot of them have died. We could cite on a large Kumyk village with a population of 11,000 people, 5,000 of which constantly live in the north of Western Siberia or in St. Petersburg. This gives us the same picture of large migration to the north as in Old Kastek. Over 25 people from the second city generation traveled from the north of join ISIS in Syria. And conclusions. There is a flexible line between radicalization of political conflicts and all three levels which were analyzed at the level of village, of cities in Dagestan, and in cities of Russia where the Dagestanis migrated. In all cases, armed conflict is a form of political conflict. Regular armed violence requires organizational and financial resource, which extremism is not able to accumulate. I would like to proceed further with this table in which political conflict, which religious compared which their transformation into armed conflicts. And instead, final table, I want to show this table with three levels and factor of politicization of religious conflicts and factor defining a shift of political conflict to an armed phase. I think that we have three very important questions. First, the mechanism of radicalization of second city generation. Second, conditions of the existence of the Caucasus Emirate. And third, conditions of the existence of terrorist network and local conflicts. Because this is an important reason of shift political conflict to armed conflict, political conflicts to armed conflicts. Thank you.
Okay. Denis, thank you very much. I'll give you a second to catch your breath. I have a number of questions, some things I would just be inclined to challenge you on a little bit. I mean, one of your first thesis is that there is not a cause and effect relationship between Islamic radicalism and violence. And the argument here is that there's nothing political inherently about religious fundamentalism and radicalization. I would challenge that, and I would say that there is something very political about religious fundamentalism, which gets termed radicalization, insofar as, well, in two aspects. One is the desire for self-rule according to religious tenets, that they want, if you want to have a system of Sharia law, if you're a Muslim, if you want to have a rabbinical court, if you're Jewish, if you want to have, I don't know what Christians do, but I'm sure they have an equivalent, that if you want to have your own system of rule, you described a village where they were training, they had military training. It's a form of secession that is inherently political. And the other aspect I would argue of this is if your religion tells you that everybody, and it's related to this, if your religion tells you that everybody in your community needs to live a certain way, that's also political in that you're imposing a political system on somebody else, which is different from the one of the state. So I would argue that, kind of the argument you make that it's state responses that politicize and make violent isn't quite right, because the political aspect is actually there from the beginning, at least for some groups. I mean, I suppose it's possible to have an interpretation that says I just want to, and I think many people do, have an interpretation that says I just want to live like this in my own house. But as soon as your interpretation is bigger than your own house, it's political.
You speak about this flexible line between
I'm challenging the idea that there isn't any cause and effect between radicalism and violence, because I would say that there is once you've got the cause and effect between politicization and violence, I would say there's also a very close relation between radicalism and politicization. That some of the politicization doesn't come from the state entirely, it also comes from the radicals. Radicalization is inherently political, that is inherently in conflict with the state, and there you get your violence. Cause and effect doesn't mean that it has to always happen, it just means that there has to be a possibility for it to happen that way.
I didn't see when radicalization was cause of politicization of community villages and of
but you don't think
shift to violence.
Okay, but you don't think that if they try to have Sharia law, that's political?
Okay, political politicization is a result of intrusion from regional political.
But the state has a, but it's the state. They're not intruding, it's their state. They belong there, right?
This is Russian state, but not the Russian state. This is Dagestan state. Dagestan state не имеет монополии на сейчас.
Doesn't have monopoly.
Doesn't have monopoly of violence.
But that's the problem, is that it doesn't have the monopoly. That's political and that's violent if they don't have a monopoly.
In Dagestan state is market of violence. It's not monopoly of violence. It's market of violence, and any people, combatants, religious groups, leader of religious group, official man, businessman, and security services. All of the people are participants of market violence in Dagestan.
But the state is meant to have a monopoly on violence, and it's trying to impose it, as states will do. That's what it's for.
Maybe there is a state, but there is a very specific state. And in Dagestan, for example, two religions group in region level, Salafis and Sufi. They competing about money, about political statuses, about authorities between each. And Dagestan state, for example, president of Dagestan or minister of internal affairs, they participant of this market. They not state. They are not ordinary statement. Because, for example, a minister of internal affairs can send not official armed group to villages, and this group intrusion in local conflict, local political conflict. This armed group associate defense interests of minister, but not interest of state, but not interest of republic. Interest of minister, for example, about financial flows.
Okay, I'm going to turn it to the audience for questions. What I'm going to ask is that everybody that I call on, please state your name and your affiliation, and please do ask a question. I'm going to take a batch of 3. And before Denis answers, so I'll take 3 questions, have Denis answer, and Cyrus is coming around with the microphone, so please also wait for the microphone. So right here.
Thank you. Yuliana Pakalova, National Defense University. Denis, thank you very much for your presentation. My question goes back to your findings over here. So one of your findings says that local armed conflicts would lead to or cause political conflict to transform into armed conflict, correct? Mm-hmm. How would that explain the transformation of fighters from local fighters, traditionally the Caucasus Emirate fighters, or local insurgents, to the fighters who went to Syria and Iraq, joined ISIS and groups like that?
Okay, so let's get 2 more questions and then we'll answer them. Okay, so yeah, up front here. Just hand over the microphone.
Ви знаєте это слово demography?
I'm sorry?
Ви знаєте это слово demography?
I think
Demography.
Can you please start off by telling us who you are?
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat.
Thank you.
My question is, since the 90s, there's been a much higher production of children in Muslim communities, including the Caucasus, compared to Mother Russia. And in fact, that means that in the Caucasus, the population has almost doubled since the troubles began. And I'm wondering if the percentage of the population that is jihadist or extremist has remained constant, or has that doubled as well? So that when we look into the future, and the population will double again because the demography has not changed, can we look forward to a doubling again of the jihadist or extremist population?
Great, thank you. Okay. Let's take 1 more question, Sophia. Значит, потому что население растет, потому что очень много детей. Связаны ли это? Значит, если в 2 раза больше детей, правда ли, что в 2 раза больше джихадистов, и будет ли это продолжаться?
Sufyan Shemukh, George Washington University. If I understood you correctly, one of your theses is that radicalization comes from the split in the Muslim community between, let's say, Salafis and Sufis. So, and then when the political machine, political elite interferes into that split, then it causes violence. So, do you think that if the political elite wouldn't interfere into that split between Salafis and Sufis, and instead, if it would try to create a dialogue inside of the Muslim community, that would lead to resolution of any conflict in the North Caucasus?
Okay, so let's do those 3 questions, and then we'll take another round.
About transformation local armed group to regional armed group and to global armed group. I don't know about this situation because members of local communities who was participants local armed conflict, they died in this conflict, or they finished violence practice, violence practice. But I know that in Turkey and in Syria, people who went to Turkey and to Syria from first generation, from after first and second Chechen war, after participation in Caucasus Emirate, they are only facilitator or a leader of groups, but they are not ordinarily participant in armed groups in Syria, because now in Syria, in ISIS, for example, majority of participants, they are from second city generation. These people who went to Syria from big Russian city. For example, this is this way. Caucasus Emirate. Only Istanbul and many participants of Caucasus Emirate was participants of Jihad and Ussr, for example. But when al-Baghdadi declared Caliphate, majority of participants of of Caucasus Emirate went from Syria to Turkey, and now they are in Turkey and, for example, in Ukraine. But participant ISIS, Islamic State, they went to Syria later and from big city. His parents migrated from Dagestan, for example, to Moscow, to St. Petersburg, to Surgut, to Tyumen, to north of North Siberian, or to Makhachkala, for example. And a participant of ISIS, this children and young brother of participant Emirate Caucasus and combatants who was in groups in Chechens wars. It's exactly. Okay. About increase of numbers of jihadists. Okay? I think this is not problem because now
of youth, the youth population, the relationship between the increasing youth population and increasing jihadists.
Because for example, about Dagestan, many people from mountain villages now went to big city, to Makhachkala. For example, during the last 10 years, from mountain village in Dagestan, about 1 million people went to Makhachkala, to Moscow, and to northwest Siberian. And this family, it is ordinary family in city. They have 1 or 2 children. It's not problem, but problem village many of members of village communities now went to big city, and next time I think that from Dagestan and from North Caucasus general we will not have many jihadists. Мы не будем иметь много джихадистов.
Yep, no, you're good.
Оттуда, да. And about interferential between Salafi and Sufi groups in North Caucasus. I think this is a good idea, but I don't know who will realize it, because this conflict, and especially armed conflict, this interesting of regional authorities. This instrument operational political opposition and political competitors. And this is a very good idea, but I don't know for для кого.
How it would happen. Okay, let's take another round. Miriam up front here. Wait for the microphone and say who you are and all of those things.
Miriam Lanskoy, NED. I have a quick comment and a question. First, this was a really interesting conversation about whether religion is inherently political and whether that is in itself radicalizing. And I'm
not sure all religion is, just at some points, some approaches to it can. But yeah,
religion, just from my kind of reaction to this, religion is going to contain a theory of justice. It's going to contain ideas about how people should lead their lives. It might be inherently, and especially the more fundamentalist versions of religion, it might be inherently political. What in these circumstances has turned it violent and extremist is precisely the context in which you couldn't pursue politics through normal political means. And it's, in fact, Dagestan is a kind of failed state in that regard. So you can compare it, you know, I don't know, with the rise of Taliban or something.
Well, I think that's
where I just want to kind of extrapolate on this a little bit, because what happened was they had to form a militia to protect themselves from predatory practices of the local security services, which sought to collect from them the way racketeers would. The conflict with the state was not about ideology or protecting like a secular minority within a religious community. That wasn't what the state was interested in. The local state was interested in collecting racketeering. And it was the ability of Karamahid to push back on the racketeering that created the conflict. So what's important here is the total state failure that leads to the violence and the extremism. And thinking about what kind of better structures within that state might prevent that from happening. But my question is actually about a different aspect of this, which was, you talked about Dagestan in different villages within Dagestan without ever talking about nationality. And I'm just wondering, you know, so I'm assuming you controlled for it and it just didn't correlate. But like, is there any connection? Are those villages Avar? I mean, I think a couple of them are Avar. So do you see any relationship between whether it's like Dargin, Avar, you know, I don't know, any Lesgin, and whether people fought either in the Caucasus Emirate or in ISIS or...
Если имеет ли какое-то влияние национальность, вопрос национальности?
Это я понял. Ты думаешь, что это еще?
Вы как-то смотрели на национальность, и если эти села аварские или даргинские, то есть как-то это влияло на то, воюют ли с Кавказским Эмиратом или ISIS или еще где-то?
Thank you for questions. It is not national factor. I think this is a factor of economy and political system before beginning of violence conflict. For example, many people from valleys of Dagestan, Kumyk and Nogay, they all of the young people went went to north of Western Siberia. For example, Nogay. In the west of North Siberian, now live 30,000 Nogays. And in Dagestani now live 20,000 Nogays. All of young men from Dagestani, from Nogay's nation, went to north of Western Siberia. And from Western Siberia, they went to Syria, but not Caucasus Emirate. They went to ISIS. And Avars, third position. Avars, numbers of Avars in north of Western Siberia, only 7,000, for example. But Avars is самый большой, better nation in Dagestan.
The biggest.
The biggest nation of Dagestan. And majority of Avars stayed in Dagestan. And they was participants of Emirate Caucasus, they was participant of local conflicts in villages where local conflicts are, where local conflicts had been, maybe. And about Dargin, same. Dargin nation, for example, Karamahi, Gubden, and Kastek, and this is the three villages where live Dargin nation, and this village have many participations of participants of of Caucasus Emirate, and but in Syria, in ISIS, Dargins and Avars from these villages. Не так много их не участвует.
There aren't many of them.
Да.
Very few of
Так
them.
много.
Okay, this time we're really going to take 3 questions and then let Denis answer them. So other, or we won't because nobody has any questions. Are there any other? Okay, yeah, please.
Marjorie Mandelstam-Balzer, Georgetown University. I have a question that follows, especially from the very first one that was asked, and from all of us who are concerned about trying to judge how radicalization happens. And it seems to me that some of the importance of what you have done, the nuances here, are that it happens in a number of different ways. And so I'd like to ask you, for instance, if we're trying to weigh the difference between the importance of a flooded village that creates radicalization because people are not only open to the corruption, but they're also forced to move. So there's that complex of problems. And then you also have the problem that seems to create more people going to Syria, which is the internet radicalization.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm asking you to do something very hard, which is to judge, судить, что хуже. Which one, how many of these factors, as we weigh them all in, should we be looking at, and which ones are more important?
Thanks, Marjorie. Do we have any other questions, comments, and interventions? Mostly questions. I'm going to, is there somebody else? I'm going to ask one more to add. I think one of the things you differentiate between is what happens in rural areas and what happens in urban areas.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other piece of this for a lot of us, there's different there's radicalization and there's the decision to use violence, right? And these are different. And there's also different definitions of radicalization we're operating with here. One is radicalization in the sense of turning to religious fundamentalism. Another is radicalization in the sense of deciding that violence is okay, which is different from choosing to use violence oneself, right? But kind of the violence piece of it is separate from the fundamentalist piece of it. Mm-hmm. And we kind of want to divide it. But my question then is, you've looked very closely at a number of villages in Dagestan. But in your research in urban areas in Russia, in your research in Turkey and other places where some of these people have ended up, you've talked to people who don't come from rural villages in Dagestan, but who have have come through some of the same processes. So my question to you is, how universal are these patterns? And to follow on Marjorie's questions, what aspects of them are more and less important? And how specific are they to Dagestan and the collapse of the state in Dagestan and all of these things that do actually make Dagestan somewhat unique? So what about this is just Dagestan, and what about it is broader? So Marjorie's question first.
Maybe second questions first.
You want to do this? Okay, either order.
Dagestan is a region where before collapsed USSR were many villages people. And Dagestan is regions where after collapse of USSR government of Dagestan collapsed.
Right. No,
collapsed more than other regions of
right.
Russia, and this is reasons. There are reasons that in Dagestan in beginning of 19th developed local conflicts. Many of local conflicts, Karamahi, Gubden, Gimri. I know 10 villages where in Dagestan developed local conflicts in middle of 1919th and later of this. But this is specific for Dagestan. But second city generation, this is not specific. Dagestan people who migrated to big city, this is ordinary people, and they children, they younger brothers, they are second city generation as second city generations from Stavropol Krai, from Astrakhan, from Tatarstan, from Irkutsk, for example. This is not difference. And I think that specific of Dagestan is emirate in Caucasus Emirate.
Okay.
But migration from big city, for example, Moscow or Tyumen, and from Makhachkala to Syria, this is not specific for Dagestan. This is general tendency of young Muslim in a region and in city where many Muslim migrants were. Okay.
Okay, and then Marjorie's question about what's most important then, which I think is related here.
Что хуже?
Что важнее? Какие из всех этих тенденций, какие из этих факторов все-таки имеют больше влияния? Что важнее? Что хуже, потому что мы, по идее, не хотим, чтобы это происходило, значит, поэтому что хуже?
I think that at каждый each level different factors are important. For example, in local level, very important local policy and local government, local management of government. In second level, in region, for example, in Dagestan, monopoly of violence, state's monopoly of violence. This is a very important factor, because without monopoly of violence of state, we have market of violence, and we will see regional conflicts as Caucasus Emirate, for example, in other region of Russia. If monopoly of violence in regional level will be destroyed in other region. For example, in Stavropol region, last years, 3 last years, I looked decrease level of monopoly of violence of state, and I look that, for example, east of Stavropol, east regions of Stavropol, east district of Stavropol, we have movements as not Caucasus Emirate now, but in future it must be as at Caucasus Emirate. This is second level, and big city. This is problem of migrants from other regions, and for big city flows of migrants. This is there are very important factors. I think that rate of migration is the first factor, and способность and ability of city management. Видеть каждого, to see each migrant. This is very important factor, because if we have collective reputation, we have ceiling,
the glass ceiling.
The glass ceiling. We have glass ceiling, and we have many factors of radicalization of migrants, not different. Muslim migrants or national migrants, maybe nation migrants now often are important, are participants of criminal movements, but migrants, Muslim migrants, now often are participants of local conflicts, for example, in Syria, because Islamic State give this opportunity. Because for national migrants, for example, Ukrainian migrants to Moscow, for example, or it's not good example. For example, from centralized region, but not Muslims. This is these people. Join to organized crime, because they don't have other opportunity.
Okay, I think we are out of time. I thought that was gave us a lot of food for thought, and I think a number of theses that I think it would be fascinating to continue to explore, both in in Russia and beyond. I think we could break this up into a few separate pieces that we could spend a great deal of time on. But since we are out of time, I would like to ask you to join me in thanking Denis. And also want to thank all of you for joining us for this conversation. So, thank you.
Thank you for your attention.